We are going to be using a grid to draw our portrait. It makes it a lot easier. It may be difficult at first to learn the grid, but once you get the hang of going one box at a time and using the proportions inside that box to draw your object or person, it makes things a lot more proportional and drawn correctly. So make sure you follow along carefully to make this easier on yourself. The most important part to keep in mind when you are drawing with a grid is that you are drawing in the right box that you are looking at. If you notice the grid that we put on our picture, it is numbered or labeled across the top and the side. So I'm going over to, down to on my picture, and then I do the same thing on my paper. Over to, down to make sure I'm in the right box. Go one box at a time, finding the halfway point on both boxes to help mark out where you're going to be drawing that object. Think of it like connect the dots, except you're making your own dots. Once your dots are created, it should be easy to go through and connect them and get the right shape to your line. This is going to help keep everything proportional. You can move on and follow that line through the next box, but make sure you're checking to see if it is proportional. Make sure that the entire time you are drawing, you are checking that you are in the right box and not drawing the wrong line. Remember, a grid is meant to help you keep the right proportion, so make sure you do it correctly so you end up with a perfect picture at the end. To start off shading this portrait, I'm going to begin with my regular number 2 pencil. Remember, we want high contrast, which means we want the lights all the way to the very darkest shade we can see in our picture. Make sure you are looking in and zooming in close on your photo, so that way you can see all those little subtle details. That is what's going to make your portrait look just like your person. Whether you're doing yourself or somebody else, you want to make sure that you capture their likeness. I like to begin shading by finding the darker areas and lightly shading those in. It's not going to be its darkest form yet, but I want to make sure that I identify those before moving on to the lighter sections and identifying those. You want to make sure that when you are shading, you don't get rid of those highlights, because the shadows are what push your picture away from you and add that depth, but the highlights are what brings it closer to you and makes it pop out at you. You will notice that as I am shading, I am not using a blending stump or my finger or any other form of smudging on this portrait. You should be able to get all of your shadows and highlights and all this shading done with just your pencil before you touch a smudge stick. To do this, you control the pressure in your pencil. If you are shading a darker area, I'm using a lot of pressure. And when I'm shading a lighter area and like fading that dark side out, I'm using less and less pressure. The best advice I can give you when shading with a pencil is to keep a dull pencil. Yes, you heard me right, dull. Generally, we like to work with a sharp pencil, but when it comes to shading, sharp pencils leave really harsh lines in our shading, and most of the time we want it to blend together. So keep a dull pencil for this first part. The only time I use a sharp pencil is when I'm trying to get a really small area, like really dark skinny line. That's the only time I work with a sharp pencil. Other than that, keep it dull. Keep in mind that this is just the first layer we're going to be doing on our portrait. There will be 2 other layers that I will go through in order to bring this to life. To avoid smudging your picture, because this is graphite or charcoal and it's very easy to smudge it with your hand, I suggest you work from the top down on your picture. But if you notice, sometimes that's difficult to do, and in my photo, I started in the center because it made sense to me and where I was going to start. So I suggest you use some type of plastic. In my class, you can use your pencil bag to put under your hand and cover the work you've already done. So as you're moving your wrist in shading, you're not smudging all that hard work you've already done. Remember, your drawing and shading is only as good as your reference photo. Make sure you're using your reference photo to capture all these details. Also keep in mind your value scale that we put together. Make sure that you are using all 8 values. From your darkest dark to your lightest light, it needs to be on your picture. Keep in mind that you can always go back and add more easily, but it is more difficult to carefully remove too much. So after I make my first pass through, I will go back and maybe in the really dark areas, put a little more pressure on my pencil to make it darker. A couple last minute reminders. You control the darkness or lightness of your pencil with the pressure. Make sure you are not leaving marks on your portrait. You should be blending. The hair is the exception. Make sure that you are hitting all 8 values in your picture. You can always go back and add more. Now that we have laid down the foundation of our graphite, we can now use that blending stump to smudge what we've already done. Keep in mind that not everything needs to be smudged. The hair, I will not do much smudging on because I want to see those lines. Whereas the face is generally a little bit smoother. That's where the majority of my blending will go into. A blending stump does not add anything to your paper. All it simply does is move the graphite that you already applied around. Keep that in mind because you should not be adding any pressure to your blending stump. It is just lightly gliding over the top of the paper to blend out the graphite that's already there. You will notice that sometimes your blending stump gets a little dirty, so I like to take an extra piece of paper or some type of scrap paper that we're not concerned with and kind of rub off some of the dark graphite that was stuck on my blending stump, especially before starting a highlight area where I don't want to really add any graphite that might be left on there, and I just want to lightly smooth out that lighter area. So remember, I use another paper to kind of wipe off some of the graphite. If you need it darker, Use a pencil to add more graphite. Do not add pressure to your blending stump. The blending stump is strictly for smoothing out your picture. You'll notice that even in this example, I still use that plastic bag technique so my hand does not accidentally smudge something in the wrong place. Now that we have started with our base coat of graphite and we've blended out with the blending stump these smoother areas, I'm now going in with a darker pencil, such as an ebony pencil, and really making sure I get those dark shadows even darker. This is going to help us bring up that contrast. Remember, contrast is like the dark versus light, they're opposites. We need the darks and we need the lights to build out the whole portrait. Remember, your dark shadows are what pushes the picture away from you, but the light parts are what brings it to you. We need both to make this look right. Make sure that you are using the entire value scale. Hey, I referenced in my class numbers 1 through 8. I need to see all numbers 1 through 8 in your picture to ensure that you have good contrast throughout your entire drawing. If you accidentally, throughout this process or ones before this, covered up too much of your highlights, you can always grab an eraser and lightly dab off in that area. Don't rub like you usually rub an eraser, just lightly tap to remove some of that graphite. It won't bring it back to a complete white, but at least it will get lighter. Remember, you need highlights and shadows to make it look realistic. We're looking for contrast. Now that the graphite is finished on our portrait, I'm going to use Prismacolors to color the object of my choice. And I chose to do the sunglasses because my grandmother loved sunglasses. And then I'm going to do them in a dark burgundy red, which happened to be one of her favorite colors as well. Remember that you want your artwork to help tell a story about you or your person that you are drawing. So make sure that you are choosing or making these choices that help tell that story. You do have the option to change the color of your object and make it not the same thing that's in your photograph. As you can see in my picture here, these sunglasses are like dark brown, and I wanted to make them red to help my story out. So I'm going to use my photograph, my reference photo, to find out highlights and shadows, not necessarily color. If you are copying your reference photo color, you need to make sure that when you get started here, you are looking at the undertones in your item's color and not just the surface overall color. To get started coloring, you've been watching me color here for a little while now, and you could see that I started out very, very soft with my base undertone of red. And now I'm going in with various other colors. You can see I have a lot there to make my shadows. I always, just like when we're using graphite, like to block in the dark shadows first so I know where I need to get the darkest, and then everything else is going to be a lot lighter. Remember, when choosing your shadow colors, black is used very, very, very little. Almost no black is ever used because black will dull out some of your colors. Whereas if you used the analogous color that is darker for whatever your base shade was, you're going to keep a much more vibrant color in the end. For instance, I have a red, so I'm using purples and maybe even a little bit of brown to help darken my reds. You can use that same tip to also apply it to the highlights. Now, I will use a little bit of white to get it as light as possible, but my lighter version of my red, according to the color wheel, the color that's next to it that's lighter is like an orange or a yellow. So I go in with those colors to keep the vibrancy. White is also going to dull out your colors just like black does. At the very end, I will use white, however, to essentially finish burnishing my coloring. We'll talk about that later. As I finish up the lens of the sunglasses here, you're going to notice that at the beginning it was very grainy, it was very thin layers. I have now built up the layers so much with many different shades and tints and highlights, and everything about my coloring is built up, that now it's what's called burnished, which means it has a shiny surface. It's kind of waxy feeling on top. That paper can no longer hold any color, and everything is now smooth. This is how we get it to look as real as possible, applying various different colors and shades until we reach the desired look. But make sure that you're doing light layers every time. If you go in with too much at once, it's not going to work. I'm now going to repeat that same process on the rim of the glasses, using several different colors, tints, and shades to lightly build up my layers to get the desired look at the end. When it comes to blending with colored pencils, specifically Prisma, it is better to color with a dull pencil. That way you don't have any harsh lines. So when it is time to sharpen your colored pencil, only do one or two turns like you see, and that's it. You want just enough that you can color with it, but not a pointed end to the pencil. The most important thing to remember is to build up in layers and use multiple different colors. For the background, I decided to use a texture sheet. I happened to find one that had stars, which fit my grandmother's love for the 4th of July very well, considering she had a 4th of July shirt on in this picture. So I'm going to place my paper on top of this, and then that way I do not move the graphite. My pencil bag is on top of the picture, and I'm applying pressure to that hand holding it still, because if it shifts on you, it's going to be more difficult to line up later. And I'm using the side of my pencil. If you notice, the way I'm holding it is different from how I normally draw. is because I'm trying to use the side of the pencil instead of the tip, so that way it gets a more solid surface. Now, as I look back at this project here, I don't like how the value of the background blends in with the picture of my grandmother. So I would either one, soften how hard I'm pressing, or darken it so that way she stands out a little bit more. Or I could even go back and add color on top. So keep that in mind when doing yours. Now, unfortunately, the texture boards are not the same size as our paper. So we are going to have to move it and align it perfectly. I'm looking at the texture board and the texture that's now on the paper to make sure it lines up. So that way when I start again, I am continuing the pattern essentially, and it's not looking messed up. Once it's in the right place, hold everything still again and finish using your texture board to make your background pattern. I decided after using the texture board in the background that there was not enough of a contrast or difference from the background to my portrait. So I decided to go back in with color that enhances the color in the glasses and kind of goes with my theme. I decided to go in with yellow for the stars and then incorporate a little bit of the navy blue from our flag. I didn't care that the graphite was blending into it because I kind of thought it helped blur out the background a little bit and give more focus on the portrait itself. My final touch that I went through and finished this off with was using the ebony pencil one more time and putting a shadow around the entire portrait to make her stand out from the background. Remember, in this project, we need to see value, not just in your pencil, but also in the colored sections as well. And then we also need to emphasize something. So that was where you put the color on the object and make the person stand out.